Thanks. All right, let's get our screen sharing going. Can you all see the webcast .txt I've got right here?
It takes a second to load, but I think it's loading right now. We can see it.
Okay, great. So my name is Josh Marnacci. I've been doing user interface design for pretty much since I started my career after graduating in the mid-90s. My personal blog, or well, I guess really my professional blog, is joshondesign.com, and @JoshMarnacci is my Twitter account. You can see here. I am currently a developer advocate for WebOS at HP Palm. I've been there for 2 years. And if you hadn't caught the news, yesterday we open sourced Enyo, our JavaScript framework. And while it's pure JavaScript, does not use GWT, it is very commonly used with PhoneGap. So some of these skills you're going to learn here today will help with that as well. I've been at Palm for 2 years. Before that, I spent 5 years at Sun working on all sorts of GUI stuff, on the Swing with Standard UI Toolkit, which I'm sure any of you who are interested in GWT are familiar with Swing, and I think you're going to really like GWT because of that. It's a very similar model. I also worked on JavaFX and the ill-fated Java store. So I've done a whole lot of work with user interfaces and developing applications, getting them out there. So I think that you're going to find this is a really good set of tools, very easy to work with, and they'll let you build applications with Java, the language you love, and get them out on lots of mobile devices, even ones that don't have Java built into them. If you do hear a baby crying, I'm not sure. He may or may not cry. I apologize for that. That's one of the wonderful side effects of working from home. He just got his shots, his booster shots, and is teething right now. So you may hear a little bit of a cry. Hopefully you won't. So let's get started. I am currently writing a book called, I think the final title is going to be Building Mobile Apps with Java using GWT and PhoneGap. This book is going to be an ebook that I'm in the final stages of writing. Hopefully I'll have it out in February, so you can buy it soon. It's gone pretty smoothly, so hopefully that will be out very soon. So to get started, you need to know what GWT is. GWT stands for the Google Web Toolkit. Let me pull this up. This is a set of tools that Google open sourced a couple of years ago, which essentially is a compiler. It takes Java code and compiles it into JavaScript code. It also provides a standard set of APIs, both ones that mimic the standard Java ones, so that you can use things like lists and maps from the Java side, and they will behave exactly the same in the JavaScript side. The other way, the other thing it adds is some additional APIs for doing web development. So it has its own UI components rather than using something like Swing or JavaFX. And it provides wrappers around all of the common DOM APIs. The nice thing is that it does all of the wrapping. It does all of the platform differences. So if you have to deploy some code to IE6, you don't have to learn all the wonky little workarounds to make the JavaScript work properly. GWT handles that for you. You just code against a nice, stable Java API. GWT does the rest. So that's GWT. PhoneGap is a set of tools, essentially build scripts and stubs, which let you take any markup, HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, and turn it into an application for a WebOS device, an iOS device, an Android device, essentially using an embedded web browser that's embedded in the app. Now, getting that all set up properly takes a fair amount of work. Also mapping to the local native APIs, such as getting the accelerometer, getting the GPS, accessing the user's address book. All of those tend to be different on each platform. So PhoneGap gives you a consistent API across all of these mobile devices. And by combining the two, GWT to take Java and produce the markup, and then PhoneGap to bundle up the markup and turn it into apps, we can build mobile apps for platforms that don't have Java built in, like the iPhone and the iPad. And I found this to be a really great combination. And coming from a Java background, I'm starting to learn to like JavaScript, but I can be so productive in Java, I didn't want to give that up. So I'm really happy that we have these tools that let us use our existing skills and put out really awesome apps. So why don't we get started? The first thing we'll need to do is download GWT. Now, I'm going to mention that the links for everything you need to download, you don't need to write them down. We'll have those all posted afterwards. So don't worry about that. GWT itself is free and open source. Just search for GWT and you'll find it. Download it and install it. And let's pull up our terminal here. Every now and then I might forget a command line invocation, which is why I wrote a book to remind me. So I created a directory called demo, and let's figure out where I installed GWT itself. There we go, GWT 2.0. All right, so inside the demo directory, we're going to run, inside GWT, it's got this little program called Web App Creator. Web App Creator is essentially a script that spits out a new project, sets up all the defaults, creates the build scripts, puts in some stub Java code, just so you have something that works and you don't have to learn where all of the stuff goes right away. So we're going to use Web App Creator and give it a name. I'm going to call my app Webcast Demo. And the package I want it to be com.joshondesign, webcast, webcast demo. You're going to see it's going to spit out a whole bunch of stuff here. And mostly we don't need to worry about it. The important stuff is the build script that it created for us. It's the standard ANT script, and it's already got all the connections to the GWT compiler, so you don't have to set up any paths. It all just works. It also pulls in a copy of the required jars. So beyond what's in this project, we don't need GWT tools anymore. Now I'm going to mention, if you start really getting into GWT, you probably want to install the GWT tools for Eclipse or whatever your favorite IDE is. It can make this task faster. But since I really want you to learn what's going on underneath, I'm going to do it all from the command line. So it included the GWT support jars, so we don't need to worry about that anymore. And it created a basic HTML, CSS page for us, which are all just filled with empty code. And then it created some basic Java code for us. So now that we've done that, we can run it. So here's our ants. Let's go into the webcast demo. Here's our ant script. Do ant dev mode. Now, you can have it build like this, and what it will do is actually generate a whole bunch of markup. But most of the time, since compiling can take a little while, what we want to do is use it in developer mode. Developer mode is really cool. It's actually an interactive debugger. It connects the JVM or your IDE, if you've got that, directly to the web browser using a special plugin. And it will incrementally recompile your application. So let's do dev mode. And this thing pops up. Launch our web browser. And let's switch tabs on me here. There we go. We have about 5 billion tabs around here. All right, now we got that sitting in the window. So this is GWT developer mode. Essentially, it has launched a teeny tiny web server which contains the generated JavaScript code and any backend code. Part of GWT is that it makes it really easy to talk to your backend code. That would be you'd write using traditional Java EE stuff like servlets and JSP. So it can actually compile the two at the same time, run the servlet jars for you, and keep everything in sync. It also provides some special APIs to do remote procedure calls so you don't have to do your own marshalling. Now, when we use the web creator, what I created was this basic web application. Not much to do here. Type in a name, and it's actually done a call back to the server, which is running in its embedded copy of Jetty, and sent that information and got a response back using AJAX. So let's take a look at the actual source code that it created. So demo, webcast. You see under source, it created all the code for me. There's an XML file. This essentially is a bunch of metadata about my project. The way GWT works, it thinks in terms of modules. These are larger than a package. Module is a big chunk of stuff, which is going to be your code, plus perhaps some custom JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. And then your code can expose certain things. So it might do a lot of stuff internally, but it only exposes particular interfaces or classes that you want it to expose. And it also handles dependency management. So it created a default module here and called Webcast Demo. And it inherits, by the way, can you see the markup well? Should I change? Let me see. Let me see if I can change the there we go. Let's change our editor scheme. There we go. That probably looks a little better. All right. And I hear that you're having a little bit of trouble hearing me. So move the phone over, a little bit better. Okay. So it's going to inherit from a standard GWT module, which is com.google.gwtuser.user. We're going to use the standard theme. And this is the class, which is the entry point to my module. And you can pretty much ignore this stuff for now. That's just the standards. So let's look at the code it actually created. There's 3 directories. One is shared. This is classes that you want shared between the client and the server. One is the server. This is a simple web service that it created called Greeting Service. And one is the client. Now, if you were creating a web deployed application, you probably would want to use the server and shared components. But since we are creating something that runs on a mobile application, really we're just focusing on the client portion. All of the markup is going to be generated, squished down into an application and actually installed on the end user's device. So there will not be a web server. It's actually all just local markup. So we're just going to ignore the server and shared stuff. It doesn't hurt for it to be there. Just ignore it. So here is my webcast demo. Everything in GWT starts with an entry point. So my webcast demo implements entry point. You can ignore this stuff for now. And on module load is the key that we want to look at. This is like the constructor or the init for servlet or a Swing application. And we create the user interface using components very similar to Swing. So there's a button, there's a text box, there's a label, and then we add them hierarchically either in layout panels or directly position them. Now, one of the cool things about dev mode is that it will magically detect when I change something and to space. So I'm going to change the text on this button. And now we will flip back here, just hit reload, and it updated. I didn't have to go through and recompile. It detected that the code had changed. All I had to do is hit reload. And now it still works. So that's basic GWT. From here, we could start by adding our own components, changing their layout, using layout panels, and there's tons of really useful third-party libraries for GWT, again, as modules. So you just import them into your module definition, so you depend on X, Y, and Z, and it will load them in for you. Handling events, again, is very similar to Swing. Here's a button. I've added a click handler. This is an anonymous interclass implementing the click handler interface. Say when it's on click, I get a click event, and then I can do something like enable the send button again, set the focus to that. Same thing, my handler is a union of the click handler and the key up handler. So again, if you're familiar with Swing, this is going to look really similar. Basic UI components, add some event handlers. The nice thing is that it's going to actually generate all the JavaScript for us, including the mapping to the particular mouse events and key events that are specific to different web browsers. It handles all of this for us, and we don't have to deal with all the scoping differences in JavaScript. The compiler does everything for us. That's it for basically GWT. From here, you can start building up applications and testing them directly in your web browser, which is one of the things I love about working this way. I don't have to actually go to the emulator or real device. I can do probably 90% of my work directly in a desktop web browser with my text editor. Okay, so now that we've got a simple running application, how can we get it into a mobile app? This is the magic of PhoneGap. As I said before, PhoneGap is a collection of build scripts and native wrappers. It turns out it actually takes a fair amount of work to get everything working properly on all of these different devices, but that's what the PhoneGap group does. Now let me give you a little bit of background on PhoneGap. PhoneGap is the set of build scripts that was created by a group called Nitobi. Nitobi was I believe a design consultancy in Vancouver, Washington, or Canada, I think. And they created PhoneGap, and it's really taken off. And it initially got very well known as part of, or for creating iOS apps, because the only way to create an iOS app using Apple's official SDK is with Objective-C or C, which can be fairly low level. So with PhoneGap, you could write in JavaScript, a lot higher level, pull in, do all of your layout with HTML markup, bring it in, and PhoneGap would do all the hard work of the Objective-C code to do all the API mappings and package it up. PhoneGap itself is open source. I believe it was under LGPL or BSD license. Now something interesting happened this fall. This was actually after I had started working on the book. Adobe bought the Nitobi company, brought them in. Adobe had also started integrating PhoneGap into some of their tools because they found this was a really great way of packaging up applications for multiple platforms. Not only that, after buying Adobe open sourced PhoneGap, which it was already open source, but they changed the license to Apache and have actually donated it to the Apache project. And this wasn't just abandoning it. They have the former Nitobi guys now, Adobe employees, working on the project. I'm on the mailing list at Apache, and they're putting in patches constantly. So I don't know exactly what Adobe's plans are, but clearly they want PhoneGap to continue getting bigger and growing. They are adding support for more features, adding support for more platforms, and because it's under the Apache license, it's freely available for everybody to use. It was really, really good news. Now, the project is changing its name. Instead of being PhoneGap, it will be called Apache Cordova. So by the time the book comes out, that may be official. They're in the final stages of getting all the code. I think it's now in Apache's repository, and there's a few more things they have to do to put out a first release that will be under the Apache name. So if you hear Apache Cordova, it's the same thing as PhoneGap. So I'm very excited that PhoneGap has a really good feature. So now that we know what PhoneGap is, let's see what we can actually do with it. So first you'll want to get the current release, which for now, go to PhoneGap.com, and you'll find it here. Download the latest release. I think, yeah, 1.3 is the latest. And let's quit our dev mode here. So to package everything up, so let me, I'll just show you really quick how this works. We're going to download it. There we go. Yes. I'm actually going to show the downloading process because it's useful to see everything that comes with the PhoneGap distribution. But some of these packaging steps may change in the new release, but it looks like it won't be too different. If anything, it will get easier. So I'm going to download that. Big. And you'll see that it's actually technically called callback right now, which is not correct. That it was the temporary name they were using. But it will be called Cordova in the final release. Yes, let me in there. Go to there we go. So if you go into the download, you're going to see a bunch of directories, one for each platform, one for Android, one for Symbian, one for Windows Phone, for WebOS. And that is very strange that they have taken away the iOS in this download. Perhaps that is a separate download. Well, we'll get to that in a second. To start with, we're actually going to use WebOS. Now, you might think, why should I start with WebOS given that iOS has the largest market share? And the reason is that WebOS has really good tools that are completely free and very easy to work with. Plus, since WebOS is itself web-based, it's closer to what we're producing with PhoneGap, which is HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. So there's very few packaging steps that we need to do. I usually start with WebOS and then bring it to iOS and then Android. Even if I'm never going to ship it on WebOS, I start the development and testing with WebOS just because the developer tools are so good. Now, if we look inside WebOS, we'll see there is a makefile and JS and lib directory. We can ignore those. Makefile will take care of that. The important thing is there's a framework directory, and inside that is a stub application. There's the basic website, or the basic web page, index.html, a copy of PhoneGap, and a little bit of metadata. And the metadata is the only thing that makes what would be a plain web page into an app for WebOS. And if we look at that, we see it's just a JSON file with a bunch of key value pairs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this WebOS directory, copy it to webcast demo _ WebOS. Oops. Copy -r. There we go. You always want to make a copy because we're going to start modifying this copy right away. Just do a make. We'll do everything, and it actually tried to install it on a device, but there was no device yet. Next thing I'm going to do is install the Palm emulator. So if you go to developer.palm.com, you can download the WebOS SDK and their emulator image. One of the great things about WebOS that it doesn't have a special emulator. It actually just, they give you an image, which is an x86 build of the entire WebOS operating system. So you can just run it in VirtualBox, which of course is open source. So I'm just going to load up this. I'm going to choose, I want to do it for the touchpad. It's going to now open up VirtualBox and restore the virtual machine I had here. And you can actually see this is one of the demo apps I'm writing for the book. It's a little Twitter search application. Let's just move that off. So this is what WebOS looks like. Let me move this down just a slight tad. And it's identical to what you're going to get on a real WebOS device. Because it's HTML and JavaScript based, most of the stuff doesn't even have to get recompiled. You don't have to do special builds for ARM. It's very nice. So now let's do this again. I'm going to package everything up, install it directly in the emulator, and launch it. And now we can see this is the standard WebOS. This is a standard PhoneGap demo app. And it just proves that you can get some JavaScript loaded as a native app and shows off a couple of the APIs. So like there's one to switch to full screen mode. There's one to get the current orientation and switch the current orientation, or either lock it into a particular one. I believe it is free. So that's really all there is to PhoneGap, and it's incredibly simple. So now we want to take this demo app and replace it with our real app. Let's go back to the GWT directory. Instead of doing ant dev mode, we're just going to do ant. And you'll probably hear the fans in my laptop kick up here, because it's actually compiling all of the Java code into JavaScript and applying a bunch of optimization. Just burn a few CPU cycles on it. All right. Now, it's actually compiling a bunch of permutations. One of the things GWT does is compile your application multiple times, once for every potential browser. Once for IE6, IE7, IE8, once for most of the WebKit ones. That way, instead of having to download one set of code, which is used for all platforms, it downloads a particular one for that very specific platform. And it also uses nice caching, so it will let the browser cache as much information as possible. Now, that's really useful if you were deploying to a web-based application where you could have lots of browsers from all over the place. But we really only care about WebKit, so there's a switch that you can set in your module to say that you really only want it to be for WebKit, and then it will skip all of those other permutations since we don't need them. And we can talk about that later. The important thing is, if we look at Webcast demo, where did that go? In the right directory? There we go, in the WAR directory. I see the problem. My terminal is too wide. There we go. That's a little better. You can see it created. We've got my standard HTML here. Mostly you can ignore this. It's a bunch of generated code. However, once it's been created the first time, it will never change again. Oh, someone says, why do we only worry about WebKit? The reason we only worry about WebKit is because pretty much every mobile browser other than Windows Phone uses WebKit. And really, we're not talking about WebKit. We're talking about modern markup. It doesn't have to put in a lot of patches to work with older versions of the browser, generally IE. So I'm using WebKit as a surrogate for modern HTML standards. And GWT will create standards-compliant web pages, but then it will also insert all of these shims to make it work on older browsers. We don't care about those shims when we're working on mobile devices. By switching that off, we're just saving a little bit of compile time. So that's our standard application again. Now we're just going to copy everything over. Copy-r*2. Where is that? Webcast demo _WebOS framework. Here. There we go. Now I'm going to go back to my WebOS directory, and I want you to see all of the stuff has been copied in here. And it's still going to go to the index.html that was created by PhoneGap rather than to mine. So I'm just going to edit the app info. We're going to go to change that to Webcast demo, and I want to give it my own package. Find.webcast demo, and let's call this version 1. 1.0.0, vendor is me, Josh, and I. And the title will be Webcast Demo. Just leave all the other values. Oh, whoops, too far, Webcast Demo. All right, now we can just run make again. Going to package everything up, only now instead of having the default PhoneGap HTML, it's got the markup that came out of GWT. And now we can see it's launching, but it didn't finish launching. So why is that? Well, that's a very specific little detail. What we have now is just plain markup. We're using PhoneGap to do the packaging into an application. But it's not actually using any of the PhoneGap APIs. PhoneGap, in addition to the packagers, has its own APIs, which handle all the differences between platforms, mapping in native APIs. But it also does a couple of extra little things. If we look at PhoneGap itself, let's search for, I happen to know that Palm System is what's required to actually make the application launch. So Palm System is a WebOS-specific API. PhoneGap is going to hide that for us, but we have to actually use it in order to make it do that. So let's load up our HTML here. Oops, wrong one. Load up our HTML here. This is what came out of GWT, and we see that it's loading up all of its own JavaScript. And if you were to look at that, you'll see why we use GWT, because this is a sort of JavaScript it generates. It's just complete gobbledygook, but it is very efficient. It's essentially using JavaScript as our executable format. Think of it as our bytecode for the web. Now we just want to add in addition to the app code, I want to load in PhoneGap dot, I call them PhoneGap dash 1.0.0.js. There we go. And now let's make it again. So this is making sure not only are we using PhoneGap for building, we are also loading PhoneGap, the API, into our application, and now we can see it works. Now, this is trying to do a remote procedure call to the server, and I don't have the server running, so this won't actually work. But we'll see, we at least get the error back that the call failed, and it opens up a little dialog. Now we have code that runs identical in the web browser and on the device, packaged up as an application. In fact, this is now ready. I could install it directly into the WebOS store. If we look, we see that it created com.joshamdesign.webcastdemo_Windows 0 for all.ipk. This is the actual file that represents a WebOS application. I can now go to the Palm developer portal. I could create an account. I could upload this directly into their catalog and submit it. That's really all there is to building a WebOS application. And for the other platforms, it's very similar. So let's try making this for iOS. How much time do we have, by the way? I think we've got enough time. Great. So, yeah. All right, so I'm going to load up Xcode. Now, one thing about PhoneGap, the vision here is that we can write in GWT and deploy for all the platforms. And with PhoneGap, it has all of these build scripts, but you still have to have the SDK for each platform. In the case of WebOS, I downloaded the WebOS SDK and its emulator that goes into VirtualBox. In the case of iOS, you have to have Xcode. It used to be that you needed a separate special SDK for iOS, but that has now been built into Xcode. And Xcode itself is free. You can get it from Apple's Mac App Store. And you do not have to have an account with Apple to use it, though to submit apps to actually submit them into Apple's iPhone App Store, you will need to have an account for that. So now let's create a new project. in Xcode. And you'll see, unlike WebOS, where it was just a build script, for iOS, it actually created an Xcode template called a PhoneGap-based application. So, and installed it into Xcode. So after you install Xcode, you run the PhoneGap iOS installer, and it gives us this extra template. So let's create it. Let's say Webcast demo, the company identifier, next. And I'm going to put it, let's see, projects, no, put it under demo. Yep, that looks good. No. We'll try Webcast demo, iOS. Demo, create. Okay. Quick question. Can you do this iOS dev stuff on a Windows box? No, you cannot. WebOS and Android you can do on Mac, Windows, and Linux, but iOS does require a Mac. I'm not sure about Windows Phone. My guess is for the final compile step you would need a Windows box with like the Windows development tool. The nice thing about doing it with PhoneGap, though, is, and particularly by doing your initial development with WebOS, you can do everything cross-platform, write your code on whatever platform you use, test it in the browser, test it on the WebOS emulator. Only for the final compile step or where you're testing any bugs that would be specific to iOS or to Windows Phone would you need an actual Mac or Windows box for those parts. So you can't completely get out of having a Mac, but you can minimize the amount of time you use. So if we look, we see Webcast Demo iOS was created for us. And inside of that is a whole bunch of goo that, in general, we don't care about, essentially. There's a whole bunch of Xcode project stuff and user data, and I don't understand how Xcode works, and fortunately I don't have to, thanks to PhoneGap. So now I can just hit run. This is just the default template that was created for me. I don't have to know anything about how it works. It's now compiled everything. It's loading up the emulator. Give that a second. The iOS emulator is actually emulating the ARM processor. So it's going to be slower than the WebOS emulator, which is running in x86 mode, which is why I encourage people to use WebOS initially, because you'll get much better speed. So there we go. It launched, though we can see it didn't find www.index.html. So what we need to do, and I have to remember the exact path here, Android, iOS. We need to copy some markup in there. So let's copy our var again. Copy-r. We're going to copy it into Webcast Demo iOS. That goes to, actually, this is one annoying thing which hopefully we will get fixed in the future, but it's not there yet. So go to Webcast Demo iOS. Okay, there's the www directory, and we can see index.html is there. So why didn't it load? The reason is that the Xcode template doesn't actually know about it. So what we're going to do is right-click on this and select Add Files, Demo, and now we're going to choose the web directory, and we're going to make sure Create Folder References for any added folders is selected. And there we go. Click Add. And now the www directory will be included in the project. Now we can stop, and we can start it again. And now we can see that PhoneGap is in fact working. Now that we know it's working, copy Webcast demo or star into Webcast demo iOS. W, there we go. And of course, this is the standard PhoneGap, and what we want is to load up our GWT app. So I'm just going to rename it. Back. Since the code is already looking for the index.html, I will stop it, run it again, and there we go. The exact same application running in the iPad simulator. And again, the same behavior that we did on WebOS. So that is pretty much it. That is all you need to know to use GWT to build applications and get them packaged up as native apps on WebOS, iOS. This exact same set of steps will work for Android. As you saw in the directory here, PhoneGap supports also Symbian, BlackBerry, Bada, Windows Phone. I haven't personally worked with those, so I don't know how great their support is. I imagine Windows Phone will continue to get better. Symbian, I think, is fairly mature, but probably isn't going to get new advanced features. And I don't know anything about the BlackBerry or Bada. But PhoneGap is under active development, and because it's open source, and now under the Apache license and the Apache project, it's getting really high profile, and I expect to see more and more applications being built this way. So why don't we get started with the questions? First, what are the drawbacks to using this approach? The drawbacks are, well, the advantages are that you're using language you know, and it's producing markup which will run everywhere. So you get that nice cross-platform example, cross-platform deployment. The drawback is fundamentally it's producing HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. This will be slower than if you were writing native code. And by native, I don't mean Java. I mean native to whatever was on that platform. So for Android, that would be Android's version of Java. For iOS, that would mean writing in Objective-C. And not only are you using that language, you're using the native APIs for that platform. So the drawback is that you wouldn't be able to have access to those native APIs, and performance will be worse. Now, some of those native APIs are mirrored through PhoneGap. So I can get to the GPS, the accelerometer. There's APIs for accessing local files, local database storage, requesting photos from the user. So a lot of the things you actually can do from the JavaScript side and therefore the GWT side. What you cannot do is like render 3D graphics, do low-level manipulation of photos. Those things you would have to either write some of your own native code and generate stubs, which would then be platform-specific, or emulate it with JavaScript, which might be a lot slower. So I would say for probably 80% of applications this will work because most apps fundamentally are about navigation and text. It's only when you're starting to do serious graphics manipulation or audio manipulation where I would go with a native solution. Our apps created with PhoneGap more intensive, resource intensive than apps created natively. I find the code actually is pretty small because the generated JavaScript can be quite tight. Typically, the size of your app is never going to be code anyway. It'll be all of the assets, the images, and sound files. So I haven't found them to be particularly larger. They will not be quite as efficient as native code because it's running fundamentally under a WebKit browser renderer. However, for most applications, it doesn't matter because the phone is just sitting there saying, did you tap yet, did you tap yet, did you tap yet? So I would say test. For the types of applications I've written, generally, it hasn't been an issue. That said, as I show in the book, you can do some graphics and animation using the Canvas API. So the last chapter of the book shows how to build a 2D game where you have a little blob guy and you tilt the device and you go back and forth and you can walk around levels, and that I can get in 30 frames per second on a first-generation iPad. So it doesn't mean that games are impossible, just that it won't be as fast as native code would be. All right, let's go on to some other questions since we've only got about 10 minutes left. Any experience with PhoneGap Build, which builds multiple platform images for you? I have not personally experienced, but I've heard good things about it. I don't know what the status is under Adobe, but it's a really awesome idea. Then you don't have to actually install the Xcode, which is 4 gigabytes, I think. And then, of course, the Android SDK and WebOS SDK. Everybody has their own SDK. So hopefully the build system will let us do, in case you don't know, PhoneGap Build is a cloud-based build system where you upload your code and it does all the native compilation for you. So I don't have personal experience with it, but it sounds really interesting. Can we use PhoneGap with PHP? PHP fundamentally is a server-side language. So the only way it would work would be if it was somehow cross-compiled into JavaScript. So I would probably say no. What do you think about the possibility of bringing WebOS into Android, both running Linux? Yes, it is off topic. Off the top of my head, I know we're making efforts to make WebOS work with the standard Linux kernel rather than its custom Linux kernel. And all the GUI applications, which were written in Enyo, that was already essentially cross-platform. What we've done is fix some bugs and change the license so that you can deploy an iOS app or even a desktop, web-based app written in Enyo, and it will work with PhoneGap using the exact same techniques I showed here. You just wouldn't use the GWT part. You would be writing the markup in JavaScript yourself. Let's see. Next question. Accessibility in PhoneGap. I don't know. I haven't looked into it very much yet. That is a very good question. Is it good for developing games for mobile devices? It depends on the kind of game. For 2D games or things that don't require super fast graphics, it'll be great. For anything 3D, you're going to need to go native code. Why did Adobe buy Natobi? I don't know. I suspect they kind of see the writing on the wall that the world is going towards HTML5, especially on mobile devices, and they have canceled Flash for mobile devices. It seems like HTML5 is the direction they're going. So I imagine they see PhoneGap as a part of that. But that's just my speculation. I don't really know. Does the book have examples of talking to your REST web service from one's app? Yes. So one of the demos in the book is talking to Twitter through Twitter's REST API. And GWT provides some nice wrappers, so you don't have to directly manipulate the AJAX queries. It does all of that for you because there's some cross-domain stuff to worry about, and GWT handles that for you. So you can call it just like you would call from Java client code. It's fundamentally just a REST HTTP request. You get some results back. And GWT will handle all of the parsing nonsense for you. There seems to be no GWT dev plugin for mobile browsers. What's the best way to dev mode for mobile development with GWT? That is a bit of a problem. Mobile browsers don't have plugins. So there's no way to directly have the GWT plugin in the mobile browser. However, most mobile devices have some sort of logging mechanism, and I talk about that in the book, where you can get access to the native log for that application. Now, it's different for every platform, but you can do it. The other thing you can do is GWT has a live console where anything that you print out to logging, it will actually show as a console in the app. That's a little annoying because it's going to take up part of your screen space, but you can actually see debugging information directly on screen. Hooking up your IDE debugger to a mobile device is a lot trickier, and I haven't gotten into that yet. That's probably something I'll do in maybe the next edition of the book. Let's see, what other questions do we have? What's the best way to learn about PhoneGap? Well, other than my book, I would say go to PhoneGap.com and join the mailing list. There's good documentation there and lots of very friendly people on the list. Is the book really only going to be 60 pages? No. It was originally planned for 60 pages. It has continued to blow up. I think I'm in the 80-page mark. But it was not meant to be a full book that would take me a year to write. It's meant to be very tight and focused. Here's how GWT works. Here's how PhoneGap works. And then here's how to make stuff look good on mobile devices. So we'll talk about using mobile CSS style sheets. There's a set of UI controls for GWT specifically designed for mobile devices that give you lists and scrollers and a real nice kind of iOS-ish look. There's a chapter on using Canvas and building a simple game, accessing local resources like the accelerometer. So, the focus was get something out very quick, and because it's an ebook, we can update it, because by the time this comes out, it might officially be Cordova, so there'll probably be an update at some point. Beyond that, asking questions about the book specifics, I'll have to defer you to O'Reilly because they know how it'll be published. Are there any other questions? More webcasts in the pipeline. Yes, we do have one scheduled for February, which will be kind of a sequel to this one. That one I will cover Canvas and building the tilting blob game that I mentioned. So I'll cover more on the graphics side. One of the things I love about GWT is I prefer to write my graphics code in Java where it's very fast and you can directly manipulate arrays. And GWT lets me write that and convert it all. Any other questions? Let's see. These in chronological or reverse chronological order? What about advanced things like maps and CoverFlow user experiences? CoverFlow would be a little harder because CSS3 transforms aren't widely supported yet on mobile devices. There are plugins to do maps. The other advantage with GWT is it has a thing called JSNI. From the Java world, I'm sure you're familiar with JNI, which is Java Native Integration. JSNI is JavaScript Native Integration. You can bind directly to JavaScript libraries. So, for example, Google's Maps APIs or wrappers, so you can connect directly to it. So the Maps part will be running in pure JavaScript, and your code will be the Java code, which has been compiled into JavaScript. So you could then embed a Google Maps app or other JavaScript libraries in your application. Let's see. Is there already a special GWT permutation for different mobile browsers? I don't believe so, but the last time I talked to the GWT team, they were thinking about that. Can you use other apps outputs like barcode scanners with GWT and PhoneGap? I'm not sure. I do know that people have created PhoneGap plugins to hook into device-specific stuff. So that might be possible. Performance tips for Android specifically. I guess try to work with the newest version of PhoneGap, or newest version of Android. Android's HTML renderer was not great, at least until the ice cream sandwich build. But it is getting faster. In general, I would say keep your UI minimal and do as much of your styling with CSS or images rather than code. Beyond that, you have to just go in and tweak performance manually. What IDE would I recommend? Google's team seems to mainly use Eclipse, which of course is free, and it has very good GWT support. So if you're an IDE person, I would go with that. I actually really like using text editors. I tend to use IntelliJ just for pure Java coding, and for everything else, I use either Coda if I'm doing web stuff or JEdit. which is like, I think of it as like the modern Emacs. It's a text editor with really good highlighting, ridiculously fast, and there's a bunch of useful plugins. So for just general writing, the book itself, I'm actually writing in JEdit, and that's also open source at jedit.org. In fact, let me get back to our webcast. So I'd say jedit.org. Of course, PhoneGap.com you need to know. What other questions do we have? We're almost out of time. Any possible danger in having a patent dispute make use of this problem for internal or apps for sale? I generally wouldn't worry about that. These patent issues deal with platform vendors, not application vendors. Any other questions? When will the book be out? Hopefully next month. I'm finishing up the writing right now. I just got a bunch of new screenshots in. I've got probably half a chapter left to write, and it's about half edited. So February is looking good. So thank you very much. I appreciate you coming to listen, and hopefully you'll enjoy the book and the next screencast we do in a month. Thanks.
Hey, Josh, thank you very much. That was a great presentation, and I could tell by the comments that people got a lot out of it and good answering questions, too. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I hope you found it worthwhile. I posted a link somewhere way back in the chat to a post-event survey if you want to give us some feedback. We read all of it, even the criticism, which hurts, but we take it to heart, so we do appreciate it. And we also select 3 people to randomly win the free ebook of their choice. So I, again, just thank you, Josh, and thank you, everyone else. And I hope you'll all be back next month for Josh's next talk. We'll send you a link as soon as the recording's ready. So thank you, everyone. Oh, thank you for posting that again. And we'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.